Welcome to the Potomac Foundation series, The Mind of the Strategist, where we interview senior defense officials who've not only been involved in innovating new strategy, but actually then had the responsibility of applying it in the real world. Today we're extremely fortunate to have Andrew Marshall, the Director of Net Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, join us for his discussion and insights into strategy formulation. He's had a distinguished background, many years at RAND in the heyday of their innovation and influence, came to Washington to work on the National Security Council, and then was the founder of the Office of Net Assessment. Welcome, Andy, to the Potomac Foundation series, and congratulations. This is, you have a double anniversary going on. This is your 92nd birthday and your 40th year in Office of the Net Assessment. So congratulations.
Right.
So first question, that it's on the lips of everybody. What does net assessment mean?
Well, as a general sense, it's really as differentiated from other kinds of analysis. It's a very two-sided, comparative type of analysis, comparing strengths, weaknesses, or the outcomes of conflicts.
The concept of comparison is critical to really
yeah.
where you're getting to the net. You're doing red and blue.
Yeah, but then making some kind of analytic conclusion as to perhaps who's ahead or which side is better in which areas. Or
Now, some aspects of net assessment involves long-range planning, where you're looking out into the future. What kind of focal length do you use when you look at it, and how does that work into the comparison?
Well, you know, in the government, I mean, the Net Evaluation Subcommittee that existed from about 53 to 63, a decade, fundamentally looked at the outcome of a large-scale nuclear exchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And my memory is they looked out about 5 years.
Right.
And looked at the projections and looked at the kind of amount of damage on each side, I think, roughly.
And the Net Evaluation Committee was in some ways sort of a precursor for your office, but they had a much narrower perspective because they were just really looking at strategic nuclear competition.
Yes. I think toward the end they began to think about broadening, and but then McNamara
Didn't want to,
whatever reason, didn't
shut them down.
Shut them down, in effect, or suggested they be shut down.
Now they went sort of a 5-year look. That's typically within the 5-year defense plan. That's kind of normal outlook. But your office also does further longer range planning, where you look out 10, 20 years?
Yes, I think we've certainly done 20 or maybe somewhat longer in some areas, but it's varied. I mean, during the time of the Soviet Union, we tended to look like 5, maybe 10 years. But once the Soviet Union collapsed and we began looking more generally at future security environment and possible opponents, we extended the time horizon. I mean, in the short term, in some sense, the U.S. didn't have a serious competitors.
Right.
I mean, so if you're going to...
So can you say a sort of a generalization that is, if you have a major rival that you're competing with, it tends to drive your time frame
somewhat shorter.
And then when you don't really have a rival and you're being much more speculative, it tends to push you out into...
That's right.
Right. Sometimes people call, I think Schwartz used the classic phrase, the art of the long view rather than calling it planning. So when you look out on the long range, is it a matter of kind of trying to predict where things go, or is it trying to come up with alternative directions? How would you describe the?
No, I mean very much in the like the Peter Schwartz and the business longer term kind of planning to look at alternative futures.
Now you were one.
And I think the important insight of Schwartz, which is often not captured with people who look at the future or make projections, that you want to look at the range of alternatives that are important to the specific kind of decisions you're trying to make. So just general purpose for your entertainment or whatever it is are not as useful.
So it's a little bit like weather forecasting. You don't really care as much what the general forecast can be.
My locality.
Yeah. Is it going to rain tomorrow? Do I need to take my umbrella? Yeah, right. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that perspective. A key element that you've developed on competitive strategies, you drew from the business community, and you're known for your multidisciplinary interests, where you've drawn things from anthropology, from business. Can you talk about the insights you've gotten from the business ground?
Well, two things. I mean, on the business side, there were these businesses like Shell and other places that used this kind of scenario planning. And so we had some connections with them, and a certain amount of the art of doing this and lessons to be learned from their experiences. So we tried to capture that, and known Peter Schwartz for a long time and involved him in some things.
Would you consider him one of the sort of the intellects of long range forecasting? Thoughtful people, right?
But then the other side of the business thing was business strategy, or the development of strategy at the Harvard Business School and elsewhere. And
particularly Porter's work on competitive strategy? Or
no, it's more the work that was prior to Porter. I mean, the people I really knew. God, I'm thinking of the name. Anyway, but no, I got in touch with those people while I was still at Rand in the late 50s.
Now, in addition to comparisons and sort of long-range looking, outward looking, net assessment is also known for thinking about strategy.
Yes. I mean, two things, I guess. One, I mean, in the Blue Ribbon panel report.
This was the 1970 panel that looked at the whole reorganization of the Pentagon and really argued for the creation of an office.
Yes, well, they argued for the creation of this Office of Net Assessment / Strategy. But as net assessment actually developed, it was the office, it was almost entirely focused really, or initially on the development of the net assessment function.
Right, which is more of a diagnostic as opposed to a prescriptive. So it's like going in,
and so
you're the doctor who says what's wrong, but you don't necessarily.
When the opportunity, though, arose to play more of a role in the strategy area, particularly it started when under Rumsfeld and
the second time as secretary.
Yeah, no, the first time.
First time,
he had expressed an interest in looking strategically. Initially, it was connection with the future surface Navy, I think. But in any case, I was encouraged by that, and so Roach and I wrote a particular paper.
This is Jim Roach, who was in your office
Yeah,
and was
right,
later
at the
Secretary
time.
of the Air Force?
Air Force,
Air Force,
yeah,
yeah.
right. So in '76, we wrote this paper urging that there be the development of real strategy, and even giving a kind of prototype of what such a strategy or set of strategies would look like. And then under Brown, we did a variety of experiments in strategy.
Can you describe those?
Well, one of them was in, I guess, strategic bombers. I mean, as an area, and we also looked at the surface Navy, but they were kind of little isolated. Kind of things.
More of a piece of a strategy.
Yeah. Well, and yes, and experiments in how to do that kind of thing within the defense framework.
Now, one of the things that's fascinating about your office is that you've worked for, by my count, at least 11 secretaries of defense, and got to know them. So leaving the current secretary aside, the previous 10 secretaries, they're very different guys,
Yes.
different styles, different backgrounds. How would you evaluate not so much them, but the different ways different secretaries used your office?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, I came to defense because of Schlesinger, although...
This is Secretary of Defense Schlesinger in
Yes,
1973.
right, but there's a long story about that because I was working for Kissinger at the time.
At the National Security Council for the White House.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I had been...
A job you thought you were going to take for a couple of months and ended up being a couple
well,
of years.
a few years, a couple of years or so. Well, I had been working for Kissinger while I was at RAND from about Thanksgiving time in '69 until the time I joined the government in early '72.
So you were serving as a consultant to the National Security Council.
Yes, doing particular studies for Kissinger, all focused on intelligence, really.
Because he and Nixon had not been happy with what they were getting from
Right, right.
Yeah.
And but as part of the Nixon reorganization of the intelligence community, it was suggested that there be created on the NSC a net assessment office, although it had two functions. One was to monitor the implementation of the Nixon reorganization of the intelligence community, but also that reorganization involved the creation of a new NSC committee on intelligence that Kissinger was to chair. And so this newly created office provided support for him because one of the functions of this new NSC committee was to give increased guidance as to what the very top level people wanted from intelligence.
So it'd be more relevant to their...
And secondly, to do studies of the performance of the intelligence.
You're going to grade them as well. You're going to help them and
give
grade
them
them.
give them a
Scorecard.
report card.
I'll bet they really appreciated
Loved
that.
it.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So And that was, but in addition, it was to start a net assessment function, and that led to lengthy negotiations during most of the time I was there before coming to some arrangement to whereby the net assessments would be undertaken. And the first one that was to be undertaken was a comparison of U.S. and Soviet ground forces, and it was assigned to the Defense Department to undertake
It was natural.
and indeed, all assessments were to be done by some other part of the government and not actually at the NSC.
So the NSC was really sort of writing the terms of reference and evaluating the product.
Well, there was to be a small group of people with representatives of the departments that would come to agreement about the topic, and then it would be assigned to one of them to do it.
Now, that, intuitively, that makes a lot of sense because the NSC sort of sits above all the different departments. But in the end, it ended up not staying there.
Yes, and it didn't get started, and so. But when Schlesinger became the Secretary of Defense, he wanted a net assessment function. Of course, Laird had too. And he wanted me to come over to set that up for him. But at that point, I'd been in Washington, and my wife had joined me in, I guess, the fall of '72. And the whole idea was that we were going to be there for a couple of years, and so it was about time to go home to California. So I was very reluctant to agree to that. So then Kissinger and Schlesinger reached an agreement to simply move the whole office over there, as well as the national responsibility for net assessment.
So leaving aside the personal impact it had on 40 years later, you're still there, and you're still here in Washington. But in retrospect, do you think that was a wise idea, or do you think it would have been better to keep that function at the NSC?
No, I think it was a wise idea for a couple of reasons. One is, I mean, Schlesinger in particular, but also depending on the secretary, but a number of other secretaries, were the best kind of audience in some sense for
customer.
They had the customer need. In a sense that up in the NSC, I'm not sure, you could say the president was a potential customer, but Secretary of Defense, at least in the military kinds of net assessment, is by far a more relevant customer.
Right. I mean, he's got to rectify the budget, the threat, the forces. Yeah.
Right, and he's someone who has some ability to influence the future evolution of the forces. Not alone. I mean, the whole government is not structured in a way that any one person has this kind of power. But
before we go to follow your transition over to the defense, how about giving a little bit of background on your relationship with Schlesinger? Because the two of you you had worked together closely. So how about picking up? You started together at RAND? Is that where you'd met each other?
Yes. Well, I'd been at RAND since January of '49, and Schlesinger came to spend the summer in Santa Monica in 1962. and maybe Rand in general, but certainly the economics department tended to have the practice of inviting people for the summer, and then selectively, if some of them seemed particularly good potential candidates to join the department, then there was a way of looking at
Sure.
them. And so
Sure, vet them out.
Schlesinger came in '62 and was assigned to me to supervise what he did.
And he had just written a book on defense economics,
Yes, that was
right?
one of the reasons I think
Right.
Hitch invited him to come.
And so a lot of people at Rand are leaving Rand at that very period to join the Kennedy administration. But so that's
Well,
what,
they had already, yes.
right.
but-
So there was almost a vacuum. In
well,
some sense.
and Hitch himself was gone
Right.
at that point.
So you and Schlesinger are left to carry the flame a little bit.
No, well, I mean, anyway, he was assigned to me, and we became quite good friends.
Right.
And and then he was invited, and he came to Rand in the spring of '63. But at that point, soon after that, in the summer, I, along with some other people at Rand, I guess they were all from the economics department, were asked to go to Paris. McNamara had come to an agreement with Sticker, who was then the I forget the exact name of the title, but
Secretary General.
Yeah.
Of NATO. Yeah.
And NATO at the time had a practice of every 5 years a review was done of, our people doing what they said and
Right.
building up their forces and this kind of thing. And the previous ones had not been run very well, and so Sticker and McNamara agreed that much more preparation would be undertaken. And so a set of preliminary or studies were laid out to be done, and then Rand was asked to send a group of people to help do this. And I was one of them.
And then that lasted. That wasn't just a short.
No, I arrived in August of '63, and I came back in to Rand in, I think the end of March of '65, and made several trips back there to wrap up the study that I was involved in.
So then with the Nixon administration, Schlesinger is brought in as what, a deputy at OMB first? Was that his first position?
Yes, he was.
Office of Management and Budget?
Yes, he was like a deputy in charge of the kind of national defense
And
parts of the budget.
And while he's doing that, you and he get assigned to do this evaluation of the intelligence committee. He was part of your supposed to be part of your evaluation. Right?
Well, what happened was that Kissinger called me up in probably August of '69 and asked me to come see him. I was previously I'd had a plan to go to France with my wife in September, and so I stopped in Washington on my way to France, where I was going to go for about a month, and went to see him, and he told me that he and Nixon were very disappointed with the performance of the intelligence community in various ways, and he wanted me to come and do two studies. One was to be a study of the whole process by which the various parts of the intelligence community decided what to send to the White House, and to make recommendations on how this process could be improved.
Because some of them would flood you with trivia, and others wouldn't send enough. And
Secondly, to do a study, a separate, independent kind of assessment of the quality of the intelligence. Was it as bad as he and
the president.
the president thought it was?
And
he
I
said,
got to ask, and your conclusion was?
and well, we'll get to that.
All right,
So
all right, I'm getting
he
ahead.
said, I can personally judge the political analysis, which is about the level of the kind of stuff you read in newspapers.
Right.
So after discussion, we decided what I was to look at was the Soviet strategic missile programs. And so I went off to France and came back and
To study the Soviet...
no,
in the south of France?
no, no. Well, one part of it was my wife and I had, we were subscribers to a French magazine, Cuisine et Vin de France. It doesn't exist any longer. And they had an arrangement where they would organize extensive visits and tastings of wine in some of the vineyards. In that year, they were going to visit the Bordeaux area. So we spent about a week, I guess, on the Bordeaux, going to the various vineyards and
I gotta ask.
and so on.
What is it with the Rand guys? You, Woolstetter, Digby, Harry Rowan, you all had this sort of gourmand palate.
Well, but there was just a cluster of.
Did it come with the intellect?
Not everybody. I mean, there was, other than the people you mentioned, there was Hitch and Bernard Brody, and Woolstetter and my wife and I, Rowan, later Digby.
But, I mean, is there a relationship between IQ and taste
No,
buds?
I don't think so. We just somehow, there's a set of us interested in food. And
So you're one of the few people that I've ever met who, when the National Security Advisor calls them in and says, I need your help, the president needs your help, and they go, I'll come back in a month after visiting France.
Well, I mean, I told him in advance, and he was agreeable to that. And so when I got back, although I got a few nagging phone calls from
What, from Al Haig?
from his assistant to Haig. When was I coming? So I showed up a little bit before Thanksgiving.
Had you known Kissinger before he
I had met
invited-
him a couple of times.
But you didn't have a close relationship.
No.
So you're working on...
And I have no idea exactly.
Yeah.
Well, except my guess is, I mean, you're on. that Clay may have been who did know Kissinger very well.
Fred Clay, who had been at Rand and then in the Nixon administration was...
yeah, I forget where he was then. He was arms control,
Right.
head of the arms control union, I think. Because I was one of the people at Rand that had gotten very involved with the intelligence community. Right. I was already also a consultant to the CIA and had been for some time.
And you had ran a team actually looking at the Penkovsky papers and analyzing those.
No, I knew about them now.
Okay. And so Schlesinger then quickly goes from deputy OMB to head the Atomic Energy Commission to CIA, then gets picked to be secretary. So he walks in as probably one of the best trained secretaries of defense we've ever had. And then he decides he needs a net assessment, or do you think he already knew that ahead of time?
Well, I mean, you need to ask him. I don't really know exactly, but he very much wanted me to do it. I mean, and also, I mean, it was at a time. I mean, great concern about how we were doing relative to the Russians. Right.
Well, one of the big issues that came out of the Blue Ribbon panel is they had raised a question that we were falling behind, and
yes, right. And there were concerns that we were or puzzles that we seemed to be building equipment that was a lot more expensive than the Soviets, and it didn't seem to be, it wasn't given credit in the kind of analysis that people did.
Also, you were kind of studying Soviet missiles. This was the period where they were really doing a major buildup in quantity and putting MIRVs on them and making them mobile. So there was a whole, and big boosters, so there was a whole period where there was a fairly significant quantitative and qualitative shift in the space of what, maybe less than 10 years.
Right.
So you were kind of the right guy at the right moment.
Yeah.
So who broke the news to you? Was it Kissinger or Schlesinger who said, Andy, we want to move this office over to...
I can't remember.
Okay. But it wasn't a big surprise to you?
No. I mean, right.
Mm-hmm. Now, you joined the Pentagon, and other than finding your first office, you brought basically your small staff.
The whole office was
moved over, right? And yet you had a good personal relationship with Schlesinger. I mean,
very close.
And I personally remember seeing there'd be a period where there'd be a meeting and all the generals file out, and you hadn't said anything in the meeting, and then Schlesinger would say, "Oh, Andy, wait a minute," and that was not lost on everybody who left the room, because he's obviously that was he.
No, well, I used to see him every day.
Yeah. Actually. Now, was that basically important for his need and your personal relationship, or do you think that there is a value in that in the Office of Net Assessment, having that daily interaction with the secretary? And part of it depends on
a lot of it was not. No, I don't think it requires that, but I think it's valuable. I mean, I think in terms of the success of the office, well, I think it was very fortunate with the first three secretaries.
Mm-hmm. So Schlesinger, Rumsfeld, and Brown.
Right.
That you worked for. Mm-hmm. Before you talk about the others, I got to ask.
Yeah.
When Brown said, "Andy, wait a minute," held you back. What did you guys talk about? I mean, oh, what are we going to have for dinner tomorrow night? Yeah, Schlesinger. When Schlesinger asked you to stay back, was it, or was he using you as a sounding board for his ideas, or was he asking you for yours? What?
I don't know. I mean, I saw him a lot. I mean, he would ask for my views on something that we may have heard, or a briefing,
Right.
or things. Or he would include me in meetings. I can remember, say, the PA&E was the name at the time.
Right.
Okay, they
the
giving.
What used to be the Systems Analysis Office.
Yeah,
and
but
now
it was
plans
by
evaluation.
that time PA&E,
yeah.
I think. Coming to brief him on their view on coming program decisions. He would ask me to sit in on. Or I traveled a lot with him when he would go down to visit bases or go on foreign trips with him, or one of the first things we did for him when we went over there was to run some of the early lessons learned efforts connected with the Yom Kippur War.
So let's talk about the war for a second, because literally the war is breaking out at about the very time you're moving into the office in the Pentagon in the fall.
Well, it had already
was already going on. As you,
yes, yes, and because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the functions of the office was the performance of the intelligence community, and in particular, we had already earlier done a number of studies of the performance in crises. And so, okay, here was one that was happening, and it gave us a chance to actually interview people while it was going on to see how the intelligence was functioning, and also we'd found in earlier assessments that there were things you just couldn't find out in retrospect, whether some particular piece of intelligence was seen by particular decision makers or not. So.
Well, and I think the modern audience doesn't appreciate, unless they live through it, the impact the '73 war had. I mean, it was a surprise. We didn't really expect it. Certainly, the Israelis didn't expect it. It went close to a nuclear crisis. Even though it started in the Middle East, all of a sudden we and the Russians are pulling nuclear alerts. It gets called up in NATO, and then there was an absolute treasure trove of Soviet equipment that was
well, and just the whole experience. And so there were later efforts. I know there was one run by the Joint Chiefs. There were perhaps others, but we ran two quickly. One was done through SLA Marshall.
The military historian from World War II, and
because of his connection with the
Israelis.
And
he'd written the book on the '67 war. The famous book.
And then another one that was quickly organized and run out of IDA, I believe.
Institute for Defense Analysis.
Yeah.
And so here you are. You're in the building. You got a war going on. You're right in the middle of the
just
action.
afterwards. I mean, it is.
Well, the aftermath of a significant crisis.
Right.
Then did you find that it was pretty easy to implement the ideas that you'd been developing in the NSC, or did you find resistance by the services? Did you find you spent quite a bit of time when I've looked back at your writings emphasizing methodology,
Right.
but then once in the Pentagon, that seems to become less important. How did things change from the way you sort of thought net assessment would work in the NSC to actually implementing it?
Well, I think, well, there are a number of things.
Yeah.
Well, in the first place, instead of there being, as it would have run over in the NSC, extensive negotiation about the topic and so on, et cetera. I mean,
And who would play
Schlesinger-
which agency? Right?
Schlesinger and I quickly came to an agreement, or the first three things he wanted looked at were the strategic nuclear balance, the balance in the Central Front, NATO, and thirdly, the kind of the general overall global naval maritime balance. And then, so we could start on those. Also, I made the point to him that it was going to take some time to clean up the data, collect the data, and organize it, and so he was patient about that, as the other people. Later, two secretaries were, and then there was another topic that both he and I were very concerned about, which led to the fourth major area that we began looking at, the so-called investment balance, of comparing the levels of resources going into the U.S. and Soviet.
And this is really where
programs.
Competitive strategy starts to play, because you're not just looking at the forces that would come into combat, you're looking at the ability to sustain
right.
that
Well,
capability.
I'll come back to the competitive strategies thing, but and then Schlesinger and I had both were skeptical about the estimates basically prepared by the CIA of the percentage of GNP that the Soviets were devoting to.
You thought they were too high, too low?
Far too low.
So you'd see this fairly large volume of military activity
Right.
on a pretty ragged economy, and you got to go.
Well, again, there, although it wasn't the initial emphasis, but I mean, here's an economy that seemed to be about half ours, that is sporting this big military that's at least as big as ours in lots of ways. And they say it only takes 6% of their GNP.
Right.
And we didn't think that could be the answer.
And later on, you concluded it was double that? At the end of the Cold War,
Well, a
when you
few
look
years
back?
later, they essentially doubled that, and then still later go up higher, and I think they never got up to the real level.
With the real impact.
For a couple of reasons. One, they were overestimating the size of the Soviet economy and underestimating the military expenditures.
So you had those four areas. Now, early on, you get kicked off the history of the strategic arms competition, which really
That was a separate thing.
from the strategic balance of Schlesinger.
Yes, right. That was a separate project.
And that, and certainly the Central Region one, involved collecting a lot of data.
That's right.
It isn't. I don't think people who haven't done it don't realize that the data
Right.
just
Well,
isn't
the
just
other
sit
thing
around.
this is more the kind of competitive strategies framework in a way. Okay, while we were looking maybe 10 years into the future, we wanted to look back 20 or 30 years and try to understand how did we get to this current position relative to that. And then, as you know, the first thing you find out that the intelligence community didn't ever go back and correct their numbers, so that if later they found out that
they were wrong,
they never kind of went back and did that. So they didn't have the right sort of numbers on the Soviet side, or it's more than the Soviets, all the and the data on the Soviets is in one set of categories, and that exists naturally on our side is for internal administrative and budgeting purposes, and they don't fit. They don't, there's a huge problem to straighten out the data.
Yeah. It's like even tanks. You say, "Oh, well, just go count the tanks." But some of them are in units, some of them are in repair, some of them are in stocks, and we organize them differently than they do.
Right.
And then, of course, it even gets more complex when you're dealing with their allies and our allies, because everybody seems to have a different method.
Right.
Have you found over the years that the consumers, the secretaries, were in fact patient and willing to invest in the effort to try to get those numbers right, because they were convinced that the trends were important?
Yes.
That's interesting, because it's sort of a deferred gratification.
I mean, it would have, the effort would have failed if people hadn't been realistic and
one give it to me yesterday.
Yeah, and from my perspective, okay, you take the first three that were
Strategic, Europe, and Navy.
Strategic, the first really good assessment, in my view, was done in '82.
So 9 years after you found
some of it is not just data, it's a matter of the right way of comparison and the range of ways in which you need to compare. In that case, the naval one was the one that first had a decent job done on it in probably 76. So, and the Central Front, I mean, I think ultimately when take everything together, it's kind of the middle 80s before you really feel fully comfortable.
So it's a 10 to 15 year investment effort to really, and you're not just comparing the numbers or our tank versus theirs, but you're looking at operational concepts, logistics, manpower, training.
Yes,
differences
although
between
even some of these areas, I mean, you never done as well as you'd like them. I mean, like training.
In reading some of the studies that were produced by your office, I was always struck by how it's hard for somebody who, for say, a U.S. military service that trains a certain way, to honestly and accurately evaluate the training of somebody else. Because if they thought it was good, they would be doing it. If it's different, it's very hard for them to get into the other guy's shoes. So just because it's different, sometimes they tend to dismiss it.
Or, well, I can remember when I first, I was still working over for Schlesinger, and General Polk came to see me.
He'd been commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe, Germany.
Europe. And I had never met him. I didn't know him, but because I was undertaking this net assessment function, he came to see me because he was very interested in that. But he told me that he had tried by asking his intelligence people at the headquarters to tell him more about training and the weaknesses on the other side. And he never really got much that was useful, and he used to visit various field intelligence organizations, and once the analysts down at the very bottom of the thing understood what kind of things he was interested in, they began collecting them for him, and he would show up at some of the places maybe every a month or 6 weeks or something.
And they'd brief him up on.
Yeah.
So
anecdotal, but very valuable to him, and he.
But they couldn't do it in the abstract or just by sending a memo. They really needed to interact with the customer, and he needed to interact with them to understand the weaknesses in their data. So that's really kind of almost a lesson that you kind of get out of the intelligence and then the assessment what you put into it. If you just is that a fair?
Right.
Let's talk about the transition. It was very traumatic, the Saturday Night Massacre and Schlesinger being gone. And then in comes Rumsfeld. So very different animal. He's been in Congress. He was a presidential appointee as ambassador to NATO. He was a counselor to the president. But he didn't, and he served as, I think, a naval aviator. But he had not had the intellectual and organizational development that Schlesinger had. How did that transition go? And
well, I was, I thought the whole thing was over. I was ready to pack up and go back to California. But
I remember the rumor was that the joint staff and DIA, the Joint Staff and DIA threw a party. Not that Schlesinger was going, but the Andy Marshall would be getting off their back.
I don't think that.
I heard that's true.
I don't think that. So, but he asked to see me, and then said no, he very much wanted me to stay on. And then we became quite good friends, and he, he found useful the stuff that we had already started on this so-called investment balance, useful for arguing about budget and so on. But he was also temperamentally very much like Schlesinger in the sense of, we can do better than we're doing, and optimistic if you kind of want to change things, and no reason we have to lose this competition.
He was also sort of a dramatic shift to an outsider, it looked like a dramatic shift, in that where Schlesinger had kept your products all basically in the building, Rumsfeld was the first to get net assessment projects, data and trend analysis into his annual posture statement.
That's right.
And also started briefing up Congress, and so there was an outreach. How did that affect your own perception of? Because you've always been fairly uninterested.
The whole notion, and this gets to the issue of where the office or the kind of function it performed, for the secretary. One of the things that that Schlesinger and I decided, after the more or less failure of that first effort on the comparison of the U.S. and Soviet ground forces, was that the future assessments were not to be coordinated documents. It would be the result of the work of the office, and they could be sent directly to him, and that he would decide what further distribution and so on. So they were.
So if I can clarify.
Initially, there's only one customer.
So what had been in the past, just to clarify for the viewers, multiple agencies would participate, but then they had a veto on whether they were concurring with it or not, and they could in fact frequently
A lot of
negotiate, compromise, water it down,
right,
homogenizing the views, right. And Schlesinger go, no, this is for me.
No,
call it like you see it.
And it also being private initially, in some sense, could be utterly frank.
Right.
About our weaknesses,
Right.
or the other guy's weaknesses, strengths, whatever.
And it seems like there's really an important need for that.
Yes.
Too often the stuff is watered down, generalized, compromised. Now, did Rumsfeld appreciate that same level of candor?
Yeah, right. And also Brown.
Mm-hmm. So, with the shift from Rumsfeld, Rumsfeld, if I remember, I was only there a fairly short time, and then you have the transition to Brown in 1977. New administration comes in, so we spent too much money on defense. Brown had written articles for Foreign Affairs saying we have to cap the volcano and the arms races running away. And generally kind of came in with kind of a dovish attitude. And then within a year, and you have things like Prim 10 and so on, but within a year of that, all of a sudden they become believers. Can you kind of describe that transition? So you have a change of administration and secretaries, and really they themselves do a significant shift in their own sense of what's going on.
Right. I'm not so much clear about the administration as a whole. I mean, but Brown, the first place I knew Brown from the past.
Had you known him when you were at Rand? He was a Secretary of the Air Force, or when he was a scientist?
I knew him initially when he was up at Livermore.
At the nuclear labs,
and we used to see him when he visited Rand. And back in the early 50s.
So again, you have a guy who's spent his career in national security.
Right.
He's a professional. He served in government agency, being Secretary of the Air Force. He's sort of the consummate professional again.
Right.
And you have the advantage of personal contact.
Yes.
Of knowledge. He knows you, you know him.
Yeah. Now, Brown is a person, I think, who doesn't like a lot of face-to-face. In fact, it's under him that we get moved out of the immediate office into policy, but with a direct reporting line. Indeed, when we finished assessments, we would send them directly to Brown, and he would decide, who else needed to see them, or he would write out kind of directions or actions he wanted taken based on the assessment.
And the Undersecretary for Policy, Ambassador Comer, was one of your biggest fans and promoters.
He was an old friend from the
and then Gene Fubini, who was sort of Brown's advisor, also was a big supporter of the office. So that helped a lot.
Right.
And you did have this direct relationship. You would send things up.
That's right.
He would send stuff back. Is it wrong to say that there was sort of a shift in leave the administration side, just in Harold Brown and people in the Pentagon's perception of the degree of danger from the Soviet Union in that period? Was there sort of awakening?
Yeah, I don't know about the the beginning how exactly where they stood, but I mean, but yes, I mean clearly by the end of the time there was Brown was pushing for increasing response to
The strategic forces.
among other.
Right. And then Comer was really the advocate for rebuilding the I always thought that that was sort of interesting in a kind of classic example of net assessment's role is you were helping diagnose the problem of the Central Region issue, and then Comer was ended up being the prescriptor.
Yeah. Well, also we did an assessment on of power projection and comparative capabilities for power projection, and we it may have led to the development of CENTCOM.
Right.
But also Brown was a person with a very strategic, I think another interesting thing about the first three, they're all very kind of strategically minded in the sense of interested in the impact of decisions we could make or actions we could take on the opponent.
And sort of thinking through the options and the implications of
Yeah,
it.
right.
Well, I think this has been a great session, Andy. What I'd like to do is then save the next administration for our next session.
Okay.
Thank you very much for being so candid, and it's really been a lot of fun. Thank you. Please join us for the next session of the Potomac series on the mind of the strategist. Thank you.